Chapter 56. The Fifth Day of Imprisonment. Her ladyship had, however, achieved a half-triumph, and the success she had obtained renewed her strength. There was no difficulty in vanquishing, as she had hitherto done, men ready to be led astray, whom the education of a gallant court swiftly drew into her snares. Her ladyship was beautiful enough to fascinate the senses, and skillful enough to prevail over all the obstacles of the mind. But on this occasion she had to strive against an untutored nature, concentrated by austerity. Religion and penitence had made of Felton a man impenetrable to all ordinary seductions. Schemes so vast, projects so tumultuous, were floating in that fervid brain that there was no room for love, the sentiment that feeds itself on leisure and thrives and fattens on corruption. Her ladyship had made a breach by her false virtue in the opinion of a man prejudiced against her, and by her beauty in the heart and sense of a pure and candid man. By this experiment upon the most rebellious subjects that nature and religion could submit to her examination, she had at last taken the measurements of powers hitherto unknown even to herself. Often, however, during the evening, had she despaired of fate and herself. We know that she did not invoke the aid of God. She trusted in the genius of evil, that boundless sovereignty which rules over the details of human life, and through which, as in the Arabian fable, a pomegranate seed suffices to build up again a ruined world. Her ladyship, being quite prepared to receive Felton, was at liberty to make her batteries ready for the next day. She well knew that only 2 days remained for her, that, were the warrant once signed by Buckingham, and Buckingham would sign it the more freely, as it bore a false name and he could not recognize the real woman whom it concerned. This warrant once signed, we say, the Baron would immediately embark her, and she knew also that women condemned to transportation use, in their seductions, arms much less powerful than those pretended virtuous women, whose beauty is illumined by the sun of fashion, whose wit is vaunted by the voice of the world, and whom an aristocratic beam gilds with its enchanted light. To be a woman condemned to a wretched and disgraceful punishment is no impediment to beauty, but it is an insurmountable obstacle to power. Like all persons of real genius, her ladyship well knew what accorded with her nature and her means. Poverty disgusted her. Subjection deprived her of 2/3 of her greatness. Her ladyship was only a queen amongst queens. The enjoyment of satisfied pride was essential to her sway. To command beings of an inferior nature was, to her, rather a humiliation than a pleasure. She would most assuredly return from her banishment, of that she had not the slightest doubt, but how long would that banishment continue? To an active and ambitious nature like that of her ladyship, the days which are not spent in self-elevation are unlucky ones. What, then, can we call the days of bitter descent? To lose 1, 2, 3 years, that is an actual eternity. To return, perhaps, after the death or the fall of the cardinal. To return when D'Artagnan and his friends, happy and successful, had received from the queen the recompense that they richly merited for their services to her. These were the desolating thoughts which a woman like her ladyship was altogether unable to endure. Besides, the storm which raged in her breast was increasing in its violence, and she would have burst her prison walls if her body could have enjoyed for a single instant the same proportions as her soul. And then, in the midst of all this, she was goaded by the remembrance of the cardinal. What would be thought, what would be said of her silence by that cardinal so distrustful, so anxious and so suspicious? That cardinal who was not only her sole support, her sole stay, her sole protector for the present, but also the principal instrument of her future fortunes and revenge. She knew him well. She knew that on her return after a fruitless expedition, she might talk in vain of her imprisonment. She would in vain exaggerate her sufferings. The cardinal would answer with the mocking calmness of the skeptic, strong at once in power and in genius, You should not have allowed yourself to be entrapped." Her ladyship then concentrated all her energy, murmuring forth in the intricacies of her thought the name of Felton, the sole gleam of light which visited her in the depths of that hell into which she had fallen, and, like a serpent coiling and uncoiling its rings, to satisfy itself of its own strength, she, by anticipation, enveloped Felton in the countless folds of her own inventive imagination. Yet time rolled on. The hours, one after the other, appeared to arouse the clock as they passed, and every stroke vibrated in the prisoner's heart. At 9 o'clock, Lord de Winter paid his customary visit, looked at the windows and bars, sounded the flooring and the walls, and examined the chimney and the doors. Yet, during this long and minute investigation, not one word was uttered either on her part or on his. "Come, come," said the Baron as he left the room. "You will not escape tonight." At 10 o'clock, Felton came to relieve the sentinel at the door. Her ladyship now recognized his step as a mistress recognizes that of her lover, and yet she both hated and despised this weak fanatic. It was not the appointed time, so Felton did not enter the room. 2 hours after, just on the stroke of 12, the sentinel was relieved. And now the time had come, and from this moment her ladyship waited with impatience. The new sentinel began to walk along the corridor. In 10 minutes Felton came. Her ladyship listened. "Observe," said the young man to the sentinel, "on no account whatever are you to leave this door, for you know that a soldier was punished for leaving his post for a moment last night, although it was I who kept guard during his short absence." "Yes, I know that," said the soldier. "I advise you, therefore, to adopt the strictest vigilance. For my part, I am going to inspect the room again and to observe this woman, who has, I fear, conceived some violent designs against herself. My orders are to watch her closely." "Good," murmured her ladyship. "There is the austere Puritan telling a lie." The soldier smiled. "Plague take it, Lieutenant," said he. "You are not badly off in getting such a commission, especially if your orders are not to go till she is ready for bed." Felton blushed. Under any other circumstances, he would have rebuked the soldier, who indulged himself in such a joke, but his own conscience was now criminating him too loudly to permit his tongue to speak. "If I call," said he, "come in, and also, if any one comes, call me." "Yes, sir," said the soldier. Felton entered the room. Her ladyship arose. "You are come," said she. "I promised to come," replied Felton, "and I have come." "You promised me something else, though," said she. "What then? Oh, my God!" said the young man, who, in spite of all his self-command, felt his knees tremble and his brow grow damp. "You promised to bring me a knife and to leave it with me after our interview." "Do not speak of that, madam," said Felton. "There is no situation, however terrible it may be, that can permit one of God's creatures to destroy himself. I have reflected that I never ought to render myself accessory of such a crime." "Ah, you have reflected," said the prisoner, again seating herself in her chair with a disdainful smile. "And also I have reflected." "About what?" "That I had nothing to say to a man who did not keep his word." "Oh, my God," murmured Felton. "You may leave the room," said her ladyship. "I shall not speak." "Here's the knife," said Felton, taking from his pocket the weapon, which he had, according to his promise, brought, although he hesitated to entrust it to his prisoner. "Let me look at it," said the lady. "For what purpose?" said Felton. "I will return it immediately, upon my honor. You may lay it upon that table and stand between it and me." Felton gave the weapon to her ladyship, who examined it attentively, and tried its point upon the end of her finger. "Very well," said she, returning the knife to the young officer. "It is a serviceable weapon. You are a faithful friend, Felton." Felton took the knife and laid it upon the table, as had been agreed with the prisoner. Her ladyship's eyes followed his act with a satisfied glance. "Now," she said, "listen to me." The injunction was unnecessary, for the young man stood before her, waiting for her words, that he might feast upon them. "Felton," said her ladyship with a melancholy solemnity, "Felton, suppose your sister, the daughter of your father, should say to you, 'Whilst still young and unfortunately beautiful, I was decoyed into a snare, but I resisted. Temptations and assaults were multiplied around me, but I resisted. The religion that I serve and the God whom I adore were blasphemed, because I called that God and that religion to my aid, and I resisted. Then outrages were heaped upon me, and as they could not sacrifice my soul, they determined forever to defile my body. At last—" Her ladyship stopped, and a bitter smile was visible on her lips. "At last," said Felton, "and what did they do at last?" "At last, they resolved one night to paralyze that resistance, which they could not overcome otherwise. One night they mixed a powerful narcotic with my drink. Scarcely had I finished my repast before I found myself sinking gradually into an unusual torpor. Although I had no suspicions, yet a nameless dread made me struggle against this drowsiness. I arose. I endeavored to reach the window to call for help, but my limbs refused to support me. It seemed to me as if the ceiling lowered itself on my head and crushed me with its weight. I stretched forth my arms and endeavored to speak, but could only utter inarticulate sounds. An irresistible numbness stole upon me, and I clung to my chair, feeling that I was about to fall. But even this support was soon insufficient for my feeble arms. I fell first on one knee, then on both. I sought to pray, but my tongue was frozen. God neither saw nor heard me, and I sank upon the floor, subjugated by a sleep resembling death. Of all the time which elapsed during this sleep, I had no recollection whatever. The only thing I can remember is that I awoke and found myself transported into a circular chamber, most sumptuously furnished, into which no light penetrated, but through an opening in the ceiling. There seemed to be no door to enter by it. It looked like a magnificent prison. It was a long time before I could observe the place in which I was, or recall the circumstances which I now relate. My mind appeared to struggle in vain against the oppressive darkness of that sleep, from which I was unable to escape. I had some vague perceptions of a space passed over, and of the rolling of a carriage, but all this was so misty and so indistinct that these events appeared rather to belong to the life of some other person than to my own, and yet to be incorporated with mine by some fantastical duality. For some time the state in which I found myself appeared so strange that I supposed it was a dream. By degrees, however, the fearful reality forced itself upon me. I was no longer in the house which I had inhabited. As well as I could judge by the light of the sun, 2/3 of the day were already spent. It was on the evening of the previous day that I had fallen asleep. My slumber had, therefore, lasted nearly 24 hours. What had happened during this protracted sleep? I arose staggering. All my slow and torpid movements showed that the influence of the narcotic had not yet ceased. I found that my chamber had been furnished for the reception of a woman, and the most complete coquette could not have formed a wish that, in looking around the apartment, she would not have found satisfied. Assuredly, I was not the first captive who had been confined within that splendid prison, but you understand, Felton, the more beautiful the prison, the more I was alarmed. Yes, it was a prison, for in vain I endeavored to escape. I tried all the walls to find a door, but everywhere the walls gave back a dull and heavy sound. I went round this room perhaps 20 times, seeking some kind of outlet. There was none, and I sank upon a chair, worn out with terror and fatigue. In the meantime, the night approached rapidly, and with the night my fears increased. I knew not what to do. It seemed as if I were encompassed by unknown dangers, amidst which I must plunge at every step. Although I had eaten nothing since the evening before, my fears prevented me from feeling hunger. No external noise by which I could compute the lapse of time had reached me, but I presumed that it must be about 7 or 8 in the evening, for we were in the month of October and it was quite dark. Suddenly the noise of a door turning on its hinges startled me. A ball of fire appeared above the window in the ceiling, casting a brilliant light into the room, and I perceived with horror that a man was standing at a few paces from me. A table with 2 covers, with a supper all prepared, was arranged, as if by magic, in the middle of the room. And this man was he who had pursued me for a year, who had sworn my dishonor, and who, from the first words which fell from his lips, left me no hope of being at any future time restored to liberty. "Infamous," murmured Felton. "Oh, yes, the wretch!" exclaimed her ladyship, seeing the interest which the young officer, whose soul seemed hanging on her lips, took in this strange tale. "Oh, yes, the wretch! He thought that it was quite enough to have abducted me in my sleep. He now came, hoping that I should yield to my shame, since that shame was consummated. He came to offer me his fortune in exchange for my love. Everything that a woman's heart can conceive of haughty scorn and of contemptuous speech I poured out upon that man. Undoubtedly he was habituated to such reproaches, for he listened to me with a calm and smiling look, and with his arms folded in his breast, and then when he thought that I had nothing more to say, he approached to take my hand. I rushed toward the table, seized a knife, and placed it to my bosom. 'Take one step more,' I cried, 'and besides my dishonor, you shall have to answer for my death.' Doubtless there was in my look, my voice, my whole appearance, that character of truth which carries conviction into the most wicked minds, for he paused. 'Your death!' cried he. 'Oh, no, you are much too charming a prisoner for me to consent to lose you so. Adieu, beautiful creature. I will wait until you are in better temper before I pay you another visit.' At these words he whistled, and the flaming globe which illuminated my room ascended and disappeared. I found myself once more in total darkness. The same noise of a door opening and shutting was, an instant afterwards, again audible. The globe of light descended anew, and I was once more alone. This moment was frightful. Had I been at all uncertain about my misery, every doubt was now dispelled before this fearful reality. I was in the power of a man whom I not only detested but despised, of a man who had already given me a fatal proof of what he dared to do. "But who was that man?" demanded Felton. Her ladyship gave no answer to his question, but continued her recital. "I spent the night upon a chair, starting at the least noise, for about midnight the lamp went out, and I was again in darkness. But the night passed away without any reappearance of my persecutor. Daylight came, the table was gone, and I had still the knife in my hand. This knife was my sole hope. I was overwhelmed with fatigue. My eyes were burning from sleeplessness. I had not dared to close them for a single instant. Daylight reassured me. I threw myself upon my bed, still grasping the protecting knife, which I concealed beneath my pillow. When I awoke, another table was arranged. But now, in spite of my terrors, in spite of my agonies, a ravenous hunger made itself be felt. For 48 hours I had enjoyed no nourishment. I ate some bread and a little fruit. Then, remembering the narcotic mingled with the water I had drunk, I did not touch that which was on the table, but went and filled my glass from a marble reservoir fixed in the wall above my toilet table. And yet, in spite of this precaution, I remained for some time in extreme anguish. Though on the occasion my fears were unfounded, I passed the day without experiencing anything that resembled what I feared. I took the precaution, however, to empty the decanter of half the water that my distrust might not be perceived. The evening came, but profound as was the darkness, my eyes began to grow accustomed to it. In the midst of this obscurity, I saw the table sink into the floor. A quarter of an hour afterwards, it reappeared bearing my supper. A moment later, thanks to the same lamp, my apartment was again lighted. I was resolved only to eat of those things with which it was impossible to mingle anything somniferous. 2 eggs and some fruit composed my meal, and then I drew a glass of water from my guardian fountain and drank it. At the first mouthful, it appeared to me no longer to have the same taste as in the morning. A sudden suspicion seized me. I stopped, but I had already swallowed half a glass. I threw the remainder away with horror and waited with the icy dew of terror on my brow. Some invisible witness had unquestionably seen me take the water from the fountain, and had taken advantage of my confidence, the more certainly to accomplish my ruin so coldly planned, so cruelly pursued. Half an hour had not passed over before the same symptoms began to reappear. Only as I had now taken no more than half a glass of water, I struggled longer against them, and instead of sleeping soundly, I fell into that kind of slumber which left me the perception of all that passed around me, whilst it quite deprived me of the power of resistance or defence. I dragged myself toward my bed to seek the sole bulwark which remained, my guardian knife, but I could not reach the pillow. I fell upon my knees, grasping with my hands one of the posts at the foot of the bed. Felton became fearfully pale, and a convulsive shudder pervaded all his frame. And what was more horrible, continued the lady, her voice trembling, as if she yet felt the anguish of that terrible moment, was that on this occasion I was conscious of the danger which hung over me. My soul, if I may so express myself, was watching over my sleeping body. I saw, I heard, as in a dream, it is true, but my perceptions were on that account only the more terrific. I saw the lamp again ascending, and was gradually left in utter darkness. I then heard the sound of that door so well recognized, although it had been opened but twice. I felt instinctively that someone was approaching me. It is said that the wretched beings who are lost in the deserts of America thus feel the approach of the serpent. I wished to make an effort. I endeavored to cry out. By an incredible exertion of my will, I even raised myself up, but it was only to fall down again immediately. "But tell me, then, who was your persecutor?" exclaimed the young officer. Her ladyship saw at a glance how deeply she affected Felton by dwelling on each detail of her narrative, but she did not wish to spare him any torture. The more deeply she wounded his heart, the more surely he would avenge her. So she once more proceeded, as if she had not heard his question, or as if she thought that the time for answering it had not yet come. I heard him exclaim when he perceived me, "Oh, these miserable Puritan women! I knew that they harassed their executioners, but I believed them to be less earnest in resisting their seducers." Felton listened without uttering aught but a sort of roar. The perspiration trickled down his brow, and with a hand hidden beneath his dress he tore his flesh. "My first impulse on returning to myself," continued her ladyship, "was to look under my pillow for the knife, which I had been unable to reach. If it had not served as a defense, it might at least be useful for an expiation. But on taking this knife, Felton, a terrible idea suggested itself to me. I have sworn to tell you everything, and I will do so. I have promised you the truth, and I will tell it, though it should ruin me." "The idea suggested itself to you to revenge yourself on this man, did it not?" exclaimed Felton. "Well, yes," said her ladyship. "It was as you have guessed. That idea was not becoming in a Christian, I know. Undoubtedly the eternal enemy of our souls himself breathed it into my mind. In fact, how shall I confess it, Felton?" continued her ladyship, in the tone of a woman accusing herself of a crime. "That idea not only came into my mind, but has never left it since. And perhaps my present sufferings are but the punishment of this homicidal thought." Go on," said Felton. "I long to hear of the accomplishment of your revenge." "Oh, I determined that it should be as short a time as possible delayed. I doubted not that he would return on the following night. During the day I had nothing to fear. On this account, at breakfast time, I did not hesitate to eat and drink. I was resolved to pretend to sup, but to taste nothing. I must, therefore, by the morning's nourishment, prepare myself to sustain the evening fast. I concealed a glass of water from my breakfast, as thirst had been my severest suffering when I remained 48 hours without eating or drinking. That day passed without producing any other effect upon me than to strengthen the resolution I had taken. But I took care that my face should not betray the thoughts of my heart, for I doubted not that I was watched. Many times, indeed, I even felt a smile upon my lips. Felton, I dare not tell you the idea at which I smiled. You would abominate me for it." Go on," said Felton. "You see that I listen to you, and I want to know the end." The evening came, continued her ladyship, and the usual circumstances took place. During the darkness my supper was served as usual, and then the lamp was lighted, and I placed myself at table. I ate only some fruit and pretended to pour some water from the decanter, but drank that which I had kept in my own glass. The substitution was, however, so adroitly made that my spies, if I had any, could have no suspicion of the truth. After supper I exhibited all the appearances of the drowsiness that I had felt the evening before, but this time, as if overwhelmed with fatigue or as if I was familiarized with danger, I pretended to fall asleep. I had now found my knife, and whilst I feigned to sleep, my hand convulsively grasped the handle. 2 hours glided away without anything new occurring. On this occasion, oh my God, who would have predicted that on the previous night I actually began to fear that he might fail to come? At last I saw the lamp gently rising and disappearing in the depths of the ceiling. My apartment became dark, but I made an effort with my glances to penetrate the gloom. About 10 minutes then elapsed, during which I heard nothing but the beating of my own heart. I implored of heaven that he might come. At length I heard the well-known creak of the door opening and shutting. I perceived, in spite of the thickness of the carpet, a step which made the floor groan. I saw, in spite of the darkness, a shadow which approached my couch. Make haste, interrupted Felton. Do you not see that every one of your words burns me like molten lead? Then, continued her ladyship, I collected all my strength. I called to mind that the moment of revenge, or rather of justice, had now arrived. I considered myself a second Judith. I held the knife in my hand, and when I saw him near me, then with a last cry of grief and of despair, I struck him in the middle of the breast. The wretch! He had foreseen the blow. His breast was covered by a coat of mail. The knife itself was blunted. Ah, cried he, seizing me by the arm and tearing from me the weapon which had so badly served me. You want to kill me, my pretty Puritan, but that is more than hatred, it is ingratitude. Come, calm yourself, my charming girl. I thought you had grown gentler. I'm not one of those tyrants who keep women in opposition to their wills. You do not love me? I had my doubts about it with my usual folly, now I'm convinced of it. Tomorrow you shall be free. I had only one wish, was that he should kill me. Take care, said I, for my liberty shall be your disgrace. What mean you, my beautiful Sibyl? Yes, for as soon as I am free, I will tell everything. I will proclaim your violence toward me. I will proclaim my captivity. I will denounce this place of infamy. You are greatly exalted, my lord, but tremble. Above you is the king, and above the king is God. Master, as he appeared to be of himself, my persecutor allowed a sign of anger to escape him. I could not see the expression of his countenance, but I had felt the trembling of his arm on which my hand rested. Then you shall never leave this place, said he. Right, I exclaimed. Then the sight of my punishment shall also be the sight of my tomb. Right, I will die here, and you shall see whether an accusing phantom be not even more terrible than the living enemy who menaces. But you shall have no weapon. There is one which despair has placed within the reach of every creature who has courage to make of it. I will die of hunger. Come, said the wretch. Is not peace of more value than such a war? I give you your liberty this instant. I will proclaim your virtue. I will call you the Lucretia of England. And I will proclaim you the Sextus. I will denounce you before men as I have already denounced you before God. And if it should be necessary that, like Lucretia, I should attest the accusation with my blood, I will attest it. Ah, said my enemy in a tone of mockery, then it is quite another thing. Faith, after all, you are well off here. You shall want for nothing, and if you allow yourself to die of hunger, it will be your own fault. At these words he left the room. I heard the door open and shut and remained overwhelmed, not so much, I confess, with grief as with the shame of having failed in my revenge. He kept his word. The next day and night passed without my seeing him, but I kept mine also, and I neither ate nor drank anything. I was resolved, as I had told him, to let myself die of hunger. I spent the day and night in prayer, for I hoped that God would forgive my self-murder. On the second night the door was opened. I was lying on the floor, for my strength began to fail me. At the noise I raised myself upon my hand. "Well," said a voice which vibrated on my ear too terribly to be mistaken, "well, have you become a little more compliant, and will you purchase liberty by a mere promise of silence? Come, I am a good noble," added he, "and although I do not love the Puritans, I do them justice, as well as to their women when they are pretty. Come, give me a little oath upon the cross. I ask for nothing more." "On the cross!" I exclaimed, raising myself up, for at that detested word I had recovered all my strength. "Upon the cross I swear that no promise, no threat, no torture shall close my lips. Upon the cross I swear to denounce you everywhere, as a murderer, as a violator of honor, as a coward. On the cross I swear, if ever I accomplish my escape, to demand vengeance against you from the whole human race." "Take care," said the voice in a tone of menace that I had not yet heard. "I have one expedient which I will only employ at the last extremity to stop your mouth, or at least to prevent anyone from believing a syllable of what you say." I rallied all my strength to answer by a laugh of scorn. He saw that from this time it was war to the death between us. "Listen," said he, "I yet give you the remainder of this night and tomorrow. Reflect. Promise to be silent, and wealth, consideration, honors even, shall surround you. Threaten to speak, and I condemn you to infamy." "You!" I exclaimed. "You!" "To eternal, ineffaceable infamy." "You!" I repeated. Oh, I assure you, Felton, I believed that he was mad. "Yes, I," he replied. "Ah, leave me," I cried. "Leave me, if you do not wish me to dash out my brains against the wall before your very eyes." "Well," said he, "you demand it. I therefore leave you till tomorrow evening." "Till tomorrow evening," I replied, sinking on the floor and biting the carpet in my rage. Felton supported himself with a chair, and her ladyship saw with demoniacal joy that the fortitude of the young officer would probably give way before the end of her recital.